First of all, thanks for the invitation. And it is a pleasure to return here in Osaka. I was here 7 years ago because every time I am on sabbatical, I try to spend a little bit of time in Japan, not only because of the very important tradition in the past and in the present of Marxist tradition, but also because it's such a beautiful country that I always like to visit. So I try to always be in touch with scholars here. And actually, the work that I've done in the past years, not only as an author, but as a serious editor of two collections, one on Marx and Engels and Marxism. The title is Marx and Marxism, New Horizons. And the new one that I opened recently, also with Routledge, both of them now, the title is Critique and Alternative to Capitalism. I have published many Japanese authors into English. And I am very happy, quite happy of this work. And one of the reasons why I'm here is also to find new books and new translation. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with colleagues later. I just wanted to ask, move forward, I go here, right? And to move back, I go here. Okay. That's it, right? So today we are having a talk on the Marx revival. And if I am not wrong, I will be asked to speak for 1 hour, so until 3, and then there will be some discussion with you. I also didn't know what kind of lecture to prepare today because I didn't know if I was going to meet students or to meet specialists. You all look like specialists of Marx and socialist thought, so I think I can provide a sort of more advanced conversation with you. But I will, of course, not say and mention anything that is too complicated for the few people in the audience that are not very much into the studies of Marx and Marxism. So before I go into my topic, that is a sort of comparison between the ideas of Marx and socialism before him at the time of Marx himself, but particularly before, and I will explain later why. I wanted to mention a little bit what brought me to the publication of this book and why I took a lot of time actually to edit the Marx revival, which is perhaps one of the most complicated books that I have edited, because you are all colleagues here. So edited books are usually underestimated in the academia today. And they are most of the time rightly underestimated, because many people do edited books just by talking to colleagues or sometimes to friends, and they give what they are writing. And then these edited books are full of discrepancies, or the quality is very different. I hope that I'm not too optimistic about the outcome of my book. I hope that the Marx revival was actually something different. So what I wanted to do in the book was to put together some of the most relevant Marxist scholars in the world today, coming from different countries, coming from different disciplines, coming from different school of thought or even political tendencies, right? And have them, discuss Marx, the relevance of Marx today. Also, when we did this, I forced them to, sort of organize a division of labor in which not everybody was doing the same quotation from Marx or discussing the same part of Marx's work, but basically I designed the boundaries of each chapter given to each author, or organized sort of conversation among them during the preparation. This took many years, and also, a little bit of authoritative editorship from my point of view. I think that the book was quite successful. The book was published in 2020 in English with this beautiful cover, Marx looking at his cell phone. And then there were many publications, many translations. The Japanese translation is the 8th edition. This is Portuguese, Spanish, Turkish, which was published at the same time, a couple of months before the Japanese edition in 2025. And there are many other editions that are forthcoming, in particular, the Chinese one with People's Publishing House, which is very significant because it was not easy to, publish this kind of critical book with the main Chinese publisher, the publisher that print the works of Marx and Engels. And the book is also entering many languages and many relevant countries where there is a sort of possibility to rediscuss Marx today, for example, Arabic and Hindu. So these are the 3 forthcoming translations for 2026. The book already reached globally around 50,000 copies sold. And this is very complicated in the present scenario, and also the fact that Cambridge accepted to publish a book like this, because Cambridge published very few books about Marx and very, very, very few edited books. So I think it was important that the book came out also in the United States, England, in the Anglo-Saxon world in that way. What I wanted to do with the book, I wanted to return to Marx and make a sort of a clarification in relation to the 21 main concepts that I indicated, that I decided. I wanted to have more, but this was not possible. And then in the book, there is a final chapter of Professor Immanuel Wallerstein, perhaps the last thing that he has written before he died. Which is a sort of history of Marxism, brief reconstruction of Marxism. But the idea is to have what Marx really wrote about the 21 topics selected, what is surpassed about Marx today, and what are the still useful, keys for interpreting contemporary society that we can find in his work. And by doing this, I wanted to, at the same time, return on some of the most relevant Marxist concept, for example, class, for example, capitalism, for example, work. But at the same time, I also wanted to discuss Marx in relation to topics that are not usually associated with him, but are present, strong in his work. For example, education, art, also religion, not only in his early years, not mentioning, of course, ecology, technology, and many other topics. So the book is basically a mix between presenting new faces of Marx and reinterpreting Marx by, demonstrating what he really wrote about some issues and making a sort of difference between the main tendencies of Marxism in the 20th century. For this reason, the book was a book dedicated to scholars of Marx and to the academia. It is actually my, very happy outcome of the book, the fact that the book is being used in many university courses. But at the same time, this is also a book for activists, for a sort of new generation of scholars, of young students, of people who are encountering, the contradiction of the world today. And also, this is a book that, in my opinion, has the ambition to say something new about Marx to people who believe that everything has been already said and written about Marx, and also to be a useful introduction, which does not mean that this book can be substituted with the reading of Karl Marx himself, but a good introduction to a generation of students, scholars, activists who encounters Marx for the first time. So this was more or less the kind of work that I prepared. And by doing this, I want to call your attention on another element that I believe useful to introduce to our discussion. I'm very much looking forward that today. So what are the characteristics of Marx revival today? The history of Marxism, the history of the reception of Marx, which is one of the main fields of my research. I've been studying with books like Marx Grundrisse after 150 years, Marx for today, and now I completed a 900 pages book that will be published at the end of this year on the history of capital in the world. So the history of all the translations of Capital, volume 1, 2, and 3 in every country, in every language of the world since his first publication in 1867. So Marx means a different idea. Marx means, something else. If we think about Marx at the end of the 19th century, in the middle of the 20th century, in South America, in Europe, before the publication of the early writings, after the publication of the Grundrisse, before, Engels, Kautsky work on the economic manuscript, after the anthropological notebooks, because there is a political turmoil in one country or there is dictatorship, because there is attention for the ecology. So Marx is a very big continent that can be explored from many points of view. And one of the topics that I also discuss in this many years of scholarship that I've done of Marx is the fact that the profile of Karl Marx has changed in comparison to other classics of political, philosophical, and economical thought, because thanks to the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, my colleague Soichiro is one of the editors of this edition. We have, every year, every couple of years now, publication of manuscripts that were unknown before, notebooks of study of experts of Karl Marx, new edition of unfragmented texts that were presented like books, but that actually books were not, like in the case of the German ideology and many of the texts. So the idea of Karl Marx, the face of Marx, has changed a little bit in this period, in this almost 30 years after the restart and the republication of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe in 1998 in Germany. I have accompanied this project personally since 2002 when I was a young PhD student and I moved to Berlin to work as a young assistant in the Mega. But at the same time, I am against, and I am here putting one possible card of discussion, interpretations that are too dramatic in this new discovery of Marx. Like I am very, very skeptical, if not completely against, the idea that once we find a new note or a new page of Marx, everybody who has read Marx before didn't understand anything about Marx. You have not read the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, you know nothing about Marx. Or this new book, notebook of study of Marx dramatically changed the interpretation of Marx. For me, this is, clearly, incorrect and wrong. There are important movements in the history of, the study, the Marx scholarship, that have really changed, the portrait of Karl Marx. The first one is the publication of the economic work that Marx left uncompleted, particularly volume 2 and volume 3, but including the critique of the Gotha program, the thesis on Feuerbach. This is the work made by Engels. And after Engels, there is even more, because it is Karkowski who prepared, the economic manuscript of 1861-63, known like the theory of surplus value. And then there is, of course, the big work of the early manuscripts, the early Marx, the early writing, the so-called the young Karl Marx, that is also located in a particular historical movement. In Europe, after World War II, that humanist Marx is the best possible Marx. And that humanist Marx is very useful to fight against the economicism and the dogmatic Marxism-Leninism that is, of course, at the center of Moscow and actually existing socialism. And then there is the Grundrisse, that is another missing piece, the missing bridge between the early writings and Capital Volume 1, published in 1867. Then there is the last one, in my opinion. It is the last significant piece of Marx that was unknown, which are the studies about anthropology, about ethnology, the studies about the so-called Global South, Marx reading Kowalewski, and now we know today Marx studying Chernyshevsky. So the last phase of Marx's life, starting from 1877, 1881, 1882. After this, there is not a new Marx, an unknown Marx, to mention the work of Martin Nicolaus, who published this very well-known article on the New Left Review announcing the English translation of the Grundrisse. So in this scenario, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe was, of course, very useful. There are also new political ways of reading Marx and also of unreading Marx politically, because Marx is no longer wrongly considered the defender of the state in Soviet Union. And actually there are more and more books published in the last 4 decades, actually in the last 2 decades. I will explain very soon why, that demonstrated the dramatical difference between Marx ideas and actually existing socialism. And then there is this new phenomenon of the so-called Marx revival today. I mentioned 2 decades and not 4, because actually between 1989 and 2008, in these 20 years, there is the least number of publications by Karl Marx and on Karl Marx ever happened in the history. This is a phenomenon that is valid in Europe, in North America, and also in Asia. So with the end of Soviet Union, with the fall of Berlin Wall, Marx is declared, like many times before, dead, but this time, definitively dead. And then, of course, there is the big economic crisis that started in 2007, 2008 in the United States that give the possibility to Marx to come back on the scene and be useful for providing, interpretations about the crisis of capitalism. I wanted to say that a significant exception to the scheme that I have presented to you right now is Latin America. Because in Latin America, Marx has already returned on the scene, and Latin America was always very different in comparison to the rest of the world. For example, I study once again the number of publications of Marx, and of course the 1960s and the 1970s are the top decades in terms of Marxist publication, Marxist reception, or what Antonio Gramsci would call Marxist hegemony in the academia, in the culture, in many, many countries, starting from the country where I was born, Italy, that had a communist party that reached 34% of the votes, just to make an example. But in this decade, actually, Latin America is under dictatorship. Most of Latin American countries are suffering, terrible dictatorship, starting in the 60s, with the 70s. The most famous one is, of course, Chile, with Pinochet replacing Salvador Allende. And therefore, Marxism is forbidden, is not only not developing like in other parts of the world, including Japan, right? These were golden decades in terms of reception, in terms of selling millions and millions of books of Marx and Engels. At the same time, when in the rest of the world there is a sort of recession of readings of Marx, in Latin America, there is a strong return. And with the so-called first wave of progressive movement, I'm talking about the beginning of this century with Chavez in Venezuela, with Evo Morales in Bolivia, particularly with the vice president of Bolivia, Álvaro García Linera, a very fine scholar of Marx and Marxism, the person who re-edited the letters to Vera Zasulich together with the notes on Kowalewski and some other anthropological manuscripts to rethink about the economic development of Bolivia in comparison with backward countries like Russia, the Obshchina, Algeria. We might discuss about this later. And then Ecuador, that was the third progressive country. This kind of wave of Marxism has permitted a sort of new interest for this author that later spread in many other Latin American countries. During the worst period in the rest of the world, for example, in European countries, everybody, and in Italy, they were ashamed about Gramsci. Don't tell us, don't remember us that Gramsci was the general secretary of the Italian Communist Party, because we are changing the name of the Italian Communist Party, so we don't want to be associated to this history. At the same time that this was happening in a country with such a strong Marxist tradition, there was a booming of Gramsci in many, many parts of the world. Think about subaltern studies in India. Think about Gramsci in Brazil, in Latin America, and even in the United States, where a more depoliticized interpretation of Gramsci made him the most cited Marxist scholar in these 2 decades, together with Walter Benjamin. So in this period, in these decades, there is something that I usually define a political return to Marx in this part of the world. And later in the United States and in Europe after the crisis, there is a return to the Marx that is interpreter of capitalism. So I could be criticized, and I criticize myself because I'm following a sort of division made very famous by Schumpeter between Marx the philosopher, Marx the economist, Marx the politician. Of course, I don't believe this. In general, I don't believe it, dividing social sciences in this way. But I'm telling you in which fields, in which way Marx is read again. For example, I was in Germany at the time of the 2008 crisis, and I remember one day buying the newspaper and reading in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, perhaps the most conservative German newspaper, the republication of Marx articles in the New York Tribune, in which he was criticizing the new crisis of capitalism that resembled the one that started in New York 150 years before. So the key for the return of Marx is, of course, the critique of capitalism. But in the last years, and with this I'm ending my introduction, and I will enter the topic of my presentation today, the relevance of Marx political ideas is also back and is calling the attention of many scholars and also a bigger audience. So if we look at the publication in the last 4, 5, 6 years, there is not only attention for the critique of capitalism and Marxian analysis of political economy, but there is also a return to his political ideas, particularly new political ideas or political ideas that were not well known in the past or were submerged by this dogmatic Marxist-Leninist ideology. For example, one of the authors of the book, Kevin Anderson, who in this book writes the chapter about ethnicity and nationalism, and has called the attention on Marx at the margin, the late studies of Marx. I also myself published an intellectual biography of the last years of Karl Marx, discussing the fact that the late Marx not only continued his studies, because many people said the late Marx is dead already in 1872 after the International. Why? Because there were no publication of Marx between 73 and 83. So in that decade, there is nothing that appeared in the classical editions like Socinenia in Russia, Marx Engels Werke in Germany, Marx Engels collected works. There is only one book against, all the economic writings of the 60s, the political writings of the International, 64 to 72, the journalism of Marx in the 50s, the early writings, philosophical writings of the 40s. So this Marx was unknown for relatively a lot of time until Lawrence Creder started to publish the anthropological, the ethnological manuscripts, and then the publication on Kowalewski, and then many more work that were done on this subject. And now we know that Marx, in the last phase of his year, not only continued his research, but actually expanded his research to topics, fields, to geographical areas that he didn't touch before in his life, or that he touched in depth in comparison with before. One example is India, and the relevance of Marx's late ideas on the development of capitalism in comparison with this early analysis when Marx was a journalist in 1853 and writing this well-known article about the effects of the British domination in India. One other example is Russia. Everybody knows about this letter to Vera Zasulich, but there is a strong process of Marx learning from Russian literature, from Russian politicians, from Russian activists, in particular the populists, in particular Chernyshevsky, Danielson, scholars that Nikolaevsky already mentioned, that he respected profoundly, that led to Marx, the very important ideas about the relationship between capitalism and socialism. So Marx is not changing the idea that capitalism is indispensable for socialism. Marxist socialism is not going back to history like many people wrote in 1970s, including here in Japan, this third world Marx. But the idea of Marx is that capitalism must not develop everywhere in the world in the same way, following one only scheme, following this very, rigid idea that Marx also himself had presented in the famous preface to the Critique of Political Economy in 1859. The idea is that society moved from slavery to feudalism and capitalism and socialism and must be like that in every country, in every place. So Marx clearly says that there is a possibility to skip the step or a part of the step of capitalist mode of production, since capitalism already appeared somewhere else, and the positive things of capitalism, that were many in order to have socialist production, can be taken directly, avoiding the Cowden forks that happened to England and to Western Europe. But all this is discussed in other works that I presented, and now I better jump on the topic that I wanted to focus more today in the rest of my presentation, the 31 minutes that I have. The topic is socialism. I am editing now, among my project, a book that is, I still haven't decided the title, but basically is Marx on post-capitalist society. And very quickly, I will try to say why I believe that this topic is relevant and also new. For now, I want to make with you an analysis of socialism before Marx, because I think it is useful to understand the work that Marx did and the differences that Marx presented, and also some relevant points that are useful for us today if we want to encounter again Marxist political ideas and theory. So I divided socialism before Marx into three groups after reading all this literature, mostly in French, but of course also in English, in German, and in a few other languages. I'm talking about the literature between 1789, French Revolution, and 1848, the big European Revolution. And the groups are socialist, communist thinkers who wanted to have absolute equality, so who thought about socialist society in terms of establishing absolute equality, radical equality among its members. The second group are the scholars who wanted to develop system of social organization and who thought that the most relevant element for change is conceiving a system, is conceiving a new form of society around which then people should reorganize their life and activity. And the third group are those who promoted concrete alternatives, the cooperatives, for example, right? So starting from small alternative communities, I will show you how capitalism can be overcome and how a new system can be changed. In this very, very exciting, because reading this literature is very good, but superficial, because my time today is limited, I want to start by this famous text that was published in 1795, the Manifesto of the Equals, that was written by Sylvain Maréchal. And in this manifesto, everyone was written has the same faculties and the same desire. So according to Marshall, we should have the same education, the same amount of food, the same portion of everything. And according to this literature, this approach is going to change the society and bring, the communist transformation. The most famous author, the most famous revolutionary activist is Babeuf. Babeuf was writing about the great principle of equality, and in his opinion, after this principle is established, borders, customs barriers, and evil government will gradually disappear. From these few sentences that I have selected for you, you can see an element that is a classic in the comparison between Marx and the other communists, Marx and the other socialists. The ignorance of political economy that many of them had. I know that I am in front of an audience of mostly, professors, scholars of political economy. Not only these early socialists and communists, but also many of them contemporary to Marx. Let me just focus on one. Let me just mention one. Bakunin. They had a very limited, understanding of political economy. And here, these people are saying, okay, basically, we will organize great equality. Everybody will have the same amount of food, the same amount of things, and society will be improved and changed. Theodore Desamis also wrote an influential book, The Community Code. We are here in 1842, few decades after, in which he proposed a world divided into communes, equal, regular, united. Each commune has a single kitchen, a common dormitory for all children, and we will live as one family in a single home. These quotations are important because they help us understand that communism at the beginning was a very totalitarian ideology. So there is dictatorship, there is totalitarianism in communism. There is no space for individuals, for free individualities, for liberties. Think about Weitling, who is the most important German revolutionary at the time of Karl Marx. He is 10 years older than Marx. And in this book, Humanity as It Is and as It Should Be, he argued for the community of gods will be the means for the resumption of humanity, transforming the earth into paradise, and there will be an enormous abundance. Once again, there is lack of understanding of political economy. Once again, there are many religious ideas from Christianity that are influencing the beginning of this socialist idea. And once again, there is this conception of forcing people into a society in which we all do the same, we all dress in the same way, we all eat the same amount of food. We understand why this ideology is coming out then, because these people are coming from dramatic economic disequalities. And because after the French Revolution, there is a very big political change, very relevant, of course, but the economic conditions are more or less the same. So people were exploited in the same way that they were exploited before. So for many people, the obvious response is equality, but radical equality. Let's give everybody the same, and this would be sophist, to have the world organized differently. Of course, this conception is very wrong and is even naive for us today. The second group is the group of people who were building ideas, systems. That's why, after all, these thinkers were called utopians. And many people, including Engels, define their socialism as a scientific socialism in opposition to utopian socialism. I don't agree with this division. I believe that it is incorrect from many points of view. Last but not least, because some of these socialists consider themselves scientists. And Saint-Simon was certainly one of them. Simon is the founder of sociology. He is the person who, discovered, critical minds, like many historians in France, younger than him. One of them was Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, and then the person who coined the word sociology. Saint-Simon is the person who focused on industrialism and had incredibly beautiful ideas before his time. But the obsession of Saint-Simon and many others is that once they found how to organize society, this is enough for society to change. So look at this citation. The old system will cease to function when ideas about how to replace existing institutions with others are sufficiently clarified. So the work of Saint-Simon was basically writing books. This is from The Organizer, an exemplary title, and trying to convince capitalist bankers to support his ideas. Saint-Simon was born in 1760, 6 years before Marx. So he is acting in a period in which class struggle and in which the industrial composition of the society is not very clear. So Saint-Simon is dividing the world in two classes, productive and non-productive. And in the productive class, capitalist and proletarian are together against the idlers, against the lazy people, against the king and his court. There were also beautiful ideas in Saint-Simon and Saint-Simonians, because utopia is also necessary for human beings in order to foresee and organize different societies. Look how beautiful this image is. So in this image, this sect, because actually, they were then following a sort of sectarian groups, and Marx was not against Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. Marx was more critical than Saint-Simonians, Fourierists, Owenists, and then Marxists, of course. Let's not forget what Marx said about the first Marxists. But look how beautiful this idea. So they wore Saint-Simonian, shirts not fastened in front, but at the back. Because the idea of Saint-Simonian society is to remind to each of us that we need the other people. So the collective element in society is fundamental. Every day somebody helped me and I helped somebody just to go out, just simply to go out. And this is sort of element of community in society. I have no time and I have to be fast, but I can talk more about this. Charles Fourier is also one eminent representative of this school of imagining ideas. And Charles Fourier is an extremely brilliant mind. Some of his ideas were, even a little bit crazy, but full of dramatic intuitions. And Marx respected very much Fourier, because Marx said, it is thanks to Fourier that we know that the change must be in the way we produce and not simply in the way we distribute. Many French socialists, decades after Fourier, were still insisting in redistribution and not focusing on the production. Among them, the main enemy of Karl Marx, which was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. But Fourier is doing this idea of working in the phalansterium. This is just imagination of Fourier. It was not done by him, but many people did organize phalansterium after Fourier, following his ideas. And the idea of Fourier is that human beings should be like butterflies, moving from one occupation to another. Of course, Fourier is not using the word alienation, because this comes from German tradition. Marx brings alienation into politics. And we know this after the publication of manuscript of 1844, the Grundrisse, chapter 6 unpublished. So it took 100 years after Marx passed away to see the relevance of alienation and estrangement in Marx's thought. But in any case, it's coming from the German tradition of Hegel, Feuerbach. But in Fourier, there is this idea that we should avoid the obsession produced by the division of labor, and inside the phalansterium there will be 5, 6 different occupations that we will be doing every day in order to avoid this terrible condition. So there were many examples of phalansterium that were done after the ideas of Fourier. But again, my time is limited. The most relevant person was this one, Robert Owen. Robert Owen was an extraordinary socialist. By the way, we always give credit to Gramsci because he said that the most relevant issue in class struggle is education. But many, many decades before Gramsci, 100 years before Gramsci, it was Owen who wrote these things. And Owen was a capitalist. And in the factory of Robert Owen, after 8 hours, the workers were no longer forced to work, but they had time for educating themselves. Because Owen believed that there is no socialism, no emancipation without education, without culture. So, very interesting. And these are some examples, because if phalansterium from Fourier is only an idea, new landmark and another experiment that 20 years in Scotland, and another experiment that Owen did in the United States were concrete initiatives that he took in order to build a new way of production. Of course, you have to start from somewhere, and they started from these cooperatives. There are many images, sometimes imaginary, sometimes true. Another important scholar, this time in France, who created communities is Etienne Cabet. Etienne Cabet is the most famous communist leader in Paris in 1848, and of course in the years before. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had a very respect for him. When they were young in 1844, they were trying to have a meeting with Cabet when they wanted to organize the Deutsche Französische Jahrbücher. So this idea of putting together the critique of religion of the German scholars with the critique of the state and socialism of the French revolutionary. An experiment that failed because people like Cabet were very worried about these atheist sentences made by the German, which was also the reason why Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte fought, because Comte was very much against Catholicism, and Saint-Simon was worried because many capitalists and bankers took the money away, the money that they were supporting Saint-Simonian's publication. In any case, Etienne Cabet, at the center of the revolution in 1848, he did something that might be considered crazy by some of us today, but he decided to go to the United States. At the time that there was revolution in France, in Europe, he moved to the United States because he wanted to create this community there, and he wrote the Icarian Constitution, going back to Icarus, right, the myth of Icarus. But look what he's writing here, that the sole and absolute director for a period of 10 years will be him, because he was the only person who knew how to establish the correct doctrine and the correct ideas. A model community in which there will no longer be property, money, buying or selling. Look how silly these ideas are from the point of view of political economy, and how anti-democratic they are from the political point of view. So there is a leader who is a dictator, but he's saying that he's acting in favor of the people, and he's just saying, like Bakunin 20, 30 years after, from now on, there are no longer money, no longer property, and this is the end. And this means that we are equal in everything. This is a sort of promised land. Beitling used to say, this is paradise on earth. He says this is a promised land, and every house will have 4 floors, and everyone will be dressed the same. By the way, 50% of the people who took the boat with Cabet returned back to France, because after a few months, this experiment was a total collapse. It is only after studying very, very carefully and hardly all these ideas that I finally, completely, I believe, understood this very famous sentence of Karl Marx, that he did not want to prescribe recipes for the cook shop of the future, or, for the menu of the cook shop of the future. This is a sentence that Marx put in Capital, Volume 1. This is not a sentence written in a manuscript when he was young. But now we really understand, because if this is the socialist literature that exists back then, before Marx, all based on telling the people what to do, all based on crazy ideas like the fork should be on the left and the spoon on the right. By changing this, we will change the perception of people in relation to capitalism. These books are full of these ideas. So now we understand why Marx said, number one, I don't want to establish a socialist system, which basically means I don't want to tell Japanese people how to do socialism in 2025. I don't want to say that socialism can be established in the same way in Argentina or in Germany. So against a system that is a sort of pre-organized approach and recipe to the transformation of society. This is clear. And at the same time, Marx is, there is a very key element that is, the core of my political interpretation of Marx. Marx is angry with Saint-Simonians, Fourierists, Hominids, because they want to look at the society according to the books written by their leaders. So Saint-Simon wrote this must be true. It's like what many Marxists did, the same after Marx. Well, Marx says we should not look at society in a sectarian way. Marx, for example, when he was leader of the International, he wrote, I published a book, Workers United is the first. We have the eminent translator of this book today. Marx says that names of revolutionaries should not be included in political programs. So Marx is saying against what all communist parties have done, because if you put the name of revolutionary there, you create this sort of dogmatic interpretation. That's why Marx is so critical of the sects that were following the elaboration. But if there is one key element that distinguishes Marx and all these scholars, is the fact that Marx is focusing on the self-emancipation of the working class. The first statute, the first note of the statute of the First International says that the working class must liberate themselves, workers must liberate themselves directly with self-emancipation. And you will see very soon how many references there are about Marxist socialism. So, on the base of this sentence, many people will say that Marx has not written about socialism, has not written about communism. That's why there should not be a chapter on communism in the book Marx Revival. I decided to write that chapter by myself because actually after a lot of work and research, I have found more than 50,000 words disseminated in the entire work of Karl Marx, published or unpublished, in which Marx discusses socialist society, the post-capitalist society. So it is wrong what many commentators have argued, because there are ideas of Marx about communism, not dogmatic ideas like this is the recipe for communism, or communism is this or is nothing else. But there are certainly indications of what are the main characteristics of communism and what are the differences with capitalism. And in my opinion, they appear in three kinds of texts, in three kinds of writings. First category of writings, mistaken ideas of the socialist, of the communist contemporary to Marx, the socialist of his times. So Marx is criticizing ideas that he regarded theoretically mistaken, but also politically dangerous. For example, in 1848, Weitling and many people say, okay, now there is a revolution in France, let's do the revolution in Germany. Let's go and create an army, and they were killed, thousands of people. So Marx is against also political silliness. Marx is also against the Paris Commune at the beginning because he believes that it's too early to have a socialist revolution. In any case, in these books that I list for you here, or manuscripts, the manuscript of 44, German Ideology, the last chapter of the Communist Manifesto, or the criticism of Proudhon that is found in these three books or texts, Grundrisse, Urtext, Critique of 1859, or the polemic with anarchism and Bakunin, or the critique of Lassalle and state cooperative included in the Gotha program 1875, you find ideas of Marx about socialism, about post-capitalist society that are coming out at the same time that Marx is criticizing the wrong ideas about socialism of other scholars. Second group, Marx himself wrote about political propaganda. Marx himself wrote militant political writings, Communist Manifesto, the Civil War in France, the book that with Professor Yuki we published together, all the addresses, resolutions, speeches of the International Working Men Association, hundreds and hundreds of pages of political writings of Marx that usually are not known. Professor Yuki knows this. The International, the work of Marx as a leader of the International is not known because it is very difficult to study. Because Marx published in the General Council, hundreds and hundreds of pages of declaration. Then there were the Congress of the International. The first were in England, so in English. The Congress were made in Switzerland, in Brussels, so they were in French. And then there are all the documents produced by the International. So there are thousands of pages that are difficult to summarize, to say this is the program of the International. So people just read the Civil War in France, that is one of the most famous resolutions, but there is much more. And then there are also all the articles, published lectures, speeches, letters to militants. There are dozens of letters that Marx and Engels received by leaders of socialist parties from the beginning of the 70s, and they are full of political ideas that could not find place in books and articles published by Marx and Engels. So from the correspondence of Marx and Engels, we find interesting ideas. And then including political documents, like, for example, the short but very relevant program of the French socialist parties when they asked Marx to write it. So in this second category, we also find thousands and thousands of pages of Marx about post-capitalist society. And then the third category, which is, in my opinion, even more important than the other one, when Marx is criticizing capitalism. When Marx is writing against capitalism, sometimes it's like he's continuing his ideas. If you are good readers of the Grundrisse, you know what I'm talking about. And there are many indications, not only of the bad of capitalism, but also of the good on socialism. So in some parts of Capital, and particularly in some preparatory manuscripts of Capital in the late 50s, in the early 60s, there are important indications about how a socialist society should be organized. If you put these three categories together, you have a lot of thinking of Marx about post-capitalist society. And the strange thing is that, but not very strange if we think about the reception of Marxism and all this return and Marx revivals, it is still in the early writings that Marx political thinking is found. And this is completely wrong. It is still in the early writings that they say there is the elaboration of Marx about communism. This is perhaps the most cited sentence about Marx ideas on communism. And it is a sentence taken from the German ideology in which, as we all know, Marx and Engels argue, according to the 95% of the interpreters, if not more, that communism is fishing in the morning, smoking the pipe in the evening, and criticize, after dinner. It is actually a Japanese scholar, Hiromatsu, who in 1976, for the first time, there was the possibility to understand what Engels wrote and what Marx wrote in this manuscript. Marx handwritings is impossible to read. So Ichiro, I'm correct, right? It's very, very difficult to read handwritings of Karl Marx. So it is usually Engels who is writing the manuscript to be sent to the publisher. And the only lines, the only words written by Marx in this sentence are criticize after dinner and critique. So studies conducted on this philological analysis made us understand that Marx is making fun of Engels, who is still following Fourieristic ideas. This is a definition of communism that is very utopian, very close to Fourier. And Marx is just making fun, by the way, using criticize. That is the title of the book against Bruno Bauer, The Holy Family, that they published exactly in the same period of this manuscript. So when they published this, like it was one single Finnish book, or a book of religion, because actually the German ideology was the religious book for historical materialism or later dialectical materialism, all this is lost. Many people started to think, including anti-Marxists, including Hannah Arendt, that this is a definition of communism. This has nothing to do with communism. And there are so many mistakes and weaknesses in the early writings of Marx. Think about 1844, when Marx is defining communism like, the realization of the Hegelian dialectic. It's just a very, very young, 26 years old student who is moving the first steps into critical thinking. So if you want to know the political thinking of Marx, the ideas of Marx on post-capitalist society, you have to go to the three categories that I mentioned before: the critique of political economy, the militant writings of Marx, the confrontation vis-a-vis between Marx and contemporary socialists. 1 hour is gone. I hope that I can take Professor Ara 5 more minutes. Is it possible? Thank you so much. And then there are other things that I will leave for later. So what is for the debate, what is the definition of communism? There are many definitions of socialism, communism in Marx, mature writings and interpretation. Is an association of free individuals working with the means of production held in common. In the Grundrisse, post-capitalist society is defined collective production. I must be quick, I apologize. In the critique of the Gotha program, he talks about a social organization based on common ownership of the means of production. He talks about cooperative society. And again, in volume 1, Marx is talking about the full and free development of every individual as the ruling principle of this higher form of society. So for me, this is a key definition, because for me, socialism and communism is freedom. This is a very big rupture. This is a very big difference. This is what we have to learn more from the 20th century. The idea that social equality is used in order to abolish freedom and liberties, which is very much connected to these dictatorial ideas of communism that I presented in the first part of this, in the second part of my lecture. So you have seen this radical equality, absolute equality. Marx's communism has nothing to do with this. He's saying that the ruling principle is free development, is the development, the liberty of every individual. Read the Grundrisse, and in his political parts is a pamphlet in favor of freedom of humanity, against the idea of freedom of capital and of the market. And once again, in the Civil War of France, he talks about self-government of the producer, a definition that we find many times and that Marx is also using against Bakunin, telling him, I am the real anarchist. Like, anarchism is socialism, is conceived correctly economically from the economic point of view. So he talks about self-governments of the community. There is even an idea of, federalism here. Look, Marx talks about against centralized governments and, in favor of provinces. So this is a very mature elaboration of a political thinking that is different from his contemporaries, but, and here I want your final attention, please, also different from what happened after Marx, what happened in Marxism, what happened in many examples of actually existing socialism. So that's why Marx's ideas about the society is an antithesis to the totalitarian system, many totalitarian systems that emerged in his name in the 20th century. And this is why Marx's writings are useful not only in this critique of the political economy, this return to Marx for interpreting capitalism, but in my opinion, they are also useful for us to rethink how an alternative to this bourgeois society, to this mode of production, to the socio-economic relations that we have in our present today, if we want to rethink. And the way, and I finish with more political notes. There are other slides, but I have no time to enter more in details. If we look at the world today, we see that there are many ideas of substituting capitalism. I found them in the Republican Party in the United States. I found them in Latin America. Look, for example, the President Javier Milei in Argentina, just to mention one person. So there is a radical agenda that the right-wing or far right-wing parties and movements are pushing forward in order to transform the society that we have today in a society that is even more privatization, is more competition among individuals, is more individualism, is back to capitalism of the 19th century, but perhaps even wilder, with even bigger inequalities in terms of global south, global north, or accumulation of wealth in the hands of few human beings. So if before 1989 there was the defeat of communism, between 1989 and today, in my opinion, there was also the defeat of social democracy, of moderate socialism. It is not a good news. It's bad news. I'm not happy about it, of course. But this demonstrates that today, if you want to change the society, or if you want to fight against some of the most economical, ecological, and many other problems of this society, you have to think about a serious alternative, a dramatical alternative to the way the world and the production is organized today. And that's why the Marx revival, and that's why the return to Marx is important, not only scholarly, in order to present Marx as a thinker much better, much brighter, much less deterministic and economicistic than it has been presented by decades by the dominant Marxism-Leninism, but also politically, because the return to Marx, if it is not read as a sort of religious way, but it is read in a Marxian way, in a critical way, is an author who can help us to understand the fundamental problems of our society. And if it's not always good in terms of providing the correct answer, I think Marx is very, very good in helping us to formulate the best possible question. And formulating the question is sometimes very important in order to provide answer and alternative answers. Thank you very much. Sorry for the little delay.